we want to sustain fisheries, produce things for society. That is food, jobs, and profitability. And as I'll talk about at the very end, we've taken that as a metric, the rebuilding of fish stocks as a metric for success, and we're not really looking at how well we're doing with regard to producing. And I'm going to, at the very end, talk about the need to reboot the whole system and say, wait a minute, what are we trying to do? And maximize sustainable food, jobs, and employment quite differently than we are. Now, ever since I remember the day, it was the 11th of May, 2016, Greenpeace launched an attack in every talk I give to start a description of funding. And I will say that the University of Washington, Science Magazine, Nature Magazine, Proceedings of the National Academy, all did reviews and concluded that yes, when a project had been funded by industry, it was disclosed in the paper. Greenpeace perspective is that if you've ever received industry funding, then every paper you ever write on fisheries has to say that you've received. So in my research program, roughly half the funding in the last 20 years has come from big American foundations, Gordon and Betty Moore, David and Lucille Packard, and the Walton Family Foundation. About 20% has come, from governments, about 13% from what I would call industry funding, and 9% what I would call community groups, although those community groups are mostly Alaskan communities that have a very vested interest in fishing. So I want to do a little historical review, and I really got into this question of, as Steve showed with the book, my background in fisheries really had been primarily fishery stock assessment up until late 2006, when a paper appeared in Science Magazine that if current trends continue, all fish stocks will be collapsed by 2048. And that was so contrary to my experience, which was started out in British Columbia, then moved to the Western Pacific, where I worked on tuna, to then Washington, and years of working part-time in New Zealand. And all of those fisheries were, to me, they seemed to be managed in a sustainable way. So Boris Worm, who was the lead of the 2006 paper, here, and NPR show together, their article made the front page of the New York Times. It made the front page of the Washington Post. It made the BBC Evening News. This was shocking, that, gosh, all fish stocks are going to be gone. We put together, we got together from the National Center for Ecological Analysis and Synthesis to say, well, why do we have such different perspectives on the future of fish? Okay, and then what we did is Boris and his co-author, well, at least Boris, some of his co-authors realized that the major deficiency in what they were, their assessment of what was going on in fisheries is they were only looking at catch. They weren't looking at abundance, they were looking at catch, and their metric was, well, if catch declines a lot, then the stock is collapsing. And there were just so many flaws in that approach. The first is that many of the places where catch is declining, they're declining because we've been regulating fisheries. So the U.S. is an example. Many U.S. fisheries catch has declined because we started regulating them more. There are lots of other flaws. For instance, off the coast of California, there were a whole bunch of stocks where the U.S. catch essentially disappeared. And it disappeared when Mexico declared a 200-mile limit, and American fishing boats were no longer going into Mexican waters to catch those species they didn't catch in California. Okay, so we built a database on fish stock abundance, and it now has about half the world's fish catch, a little more than half the stocks that constitute half the world's fish catch. We've also completed another study, also analysis and synthesis. I'll be some of these results, and essentially all the results I'm showing here are the results of these big international study groups that where lots of people contribute data. In fact, mostly my role in recent years has been organizational rather than analytic. But one of the results of the 2006 paper was this pervasive sense of doom and gloom. And as it just drives me crazy that to see paper after paper say, oh, world fish stocks are disappearing. Everybody knows that. In fact, and it's not just scientific papers. What's it called? The International Program. It's an evaluation of global biodiversity. And it quotes that all fish will be gone by 2048, and its reference is a newspaper article. Okay. So this is some of the coverage that came out in November of 2006. National Geographic magazine, Time magazine, and it continues on. I mean, you can videos and you would find all of these things quoted. A very important one for me, which I'm going to talk about, was this is now 2009, so a few years later. How appetite for killing off one of the ocean's most magnificent creatures, and it's gotten so that this is a picture of the menu from a restaurant in Santiago, Chile. Okay, and fish restaurant, but don't eat tuna. There's only 4% left. Okay. In reality, about 60% or so of the tuna that were in the oceans in 1900 are there now. Tuna are actually, on average, underexploited, not overexploited. Anyway, so one of the problems NC that Boris and I organized is this database we call the RAM Legacy Stock Assessment Database, after Ransom Myers, who had database that was mostly built around spawner recruit data, and died, unfortunately, this work. And we've made the database since the 2007, 8, and 9 period. We have a release that is currently online, version 3.30. It has about 1,200 stocks if you include Pacific salmon, about 850 marine represent about 54% of global fish. This shows the coverage of the database. For each country, the size of the circle is the amount of catch reported to FAO, and is what proportion of that catch is represented in the stocks we have covered. So in the United States, we have most stocks covered, but there are hundreds of stocks we don't have covered. These typically are quite small stocks. And the big thing you can see here is that we have the Americas quite well covered. Mexico's, we're working on that. Europe, pretty well covered. We have in out Africa, we have South Africa and Northwest Africa, which we've shaded in there as Morocco, but it's really off the coast of Northwest Africa. We have New Zealand, Australia, Japan, and Russia, pretty well covered. What we're really missing in terms of the big fisheries of the world is Southeast Asia, and that is because there are no publicly available, in fact, there are no significant stock assessments that have tried to reconstruct the history of abundance and catch in those fisheries, and that's a priority. So one of the things we do with this database is say, well, what's the trend in abundance? And so this is across the entire database of fish since 1950, giving each stock equal weight, so big ones and small ones, the same weight, and that green line is the estimate. Each stock is scaled relative to the level that the stock assessment predicts would produce maximum sustainable yield. So you see that back in 1950, on average about twice the level would produce maximum sustainable yield. It declined through about to the 1990s, and since the mid-1990s, on average, stocks have been increasing in abundance. So the idea that stocks continue to disappear is simply not true. Now, in some places they are, some places they aren't, and I'll look in a little more detail at where they're going up, where they're going down. Why did they decline and then increase? It's really quite simple. This is the fishing pressure that back in the 1950s, on average, fishing pressure was very low. It increased so that by the 1990s, it was actually above the level that would produce maximum sustainable yield. Since then, again, averaged across 800 stocks, it has declined probably by a third. So we've been reducing fishing pressure a lot, and we've seen essentially the stop in decline and turnaround. Now, let's see if we can do this. Yeah, okay. So this is now for a whole bunch of specific regions. What you see in blue is abundance, and in red is the fishing pressure. So let's take U.S. East Coast, upper right-hand corner. And what you see is fishing pressure was rising into about 1990, and essentially with the 1996 Magnuson, that's right. Okay, yes, I forgot about that. That's kind of wrong. We see fishing pressure, there's 1996, there's 2000. We've seen a significant decline, and we've seen some increase. If you weight this differently, you get that doesn't actually look like a lot of increase in scale. U.S. Southeastern Gulf, you see the same pattern, coinciding with much more stringent elements of the Magnuson-Stevens Act, and you see rebuilding. U.S. West Coast, more dramatic rebuilding. Let's see, South America, we haven't seen European non-EU, so that's Norway. Their stocks have been rebuilding for quite a while. Canada East Coast is interesting, but big collapse of their stocks. A little bit of increase, even though they've got very, very low exploitation rates. And then places like the Mediterranean, I mean, that's the biggest European Commission countries, but they have not had any success at mortality rates, and their stocks continue to decline. Northwest, where's Northwest Africa? Does anyone see it on here? Oh, right there, yeah. Northwest Africa is again a place that assessments are sparse, but fishing mortality rates are still typically way too high. Okay, so in general, stocks on average are actually about where we would like them to be, but it's very different from region to region. So what's happened to producing food? And what we see is we have not seen, and the solid orange line is our best estimate. That's a state space model. We've seen catches decline and decline and decline. So for those people who only think about catch, they say, oh, things are getting worse and worse because catch is going down. If you worry about social economic, that's certainly a problem. That in fact, well, I'll show you some examples. We'll get into that a little more. So, how we assess the performance of our fisheries. So this is from a NOAA, and 98% stock sustainability index is increased, or 98%. 39 stocks rebuilt. 84% of federally managed stocks are not on the overfish list. 91% are not overfishing. 473 are managed under 406 management plans. 2 stocks rebuilt in 2014. So my point is, we've got a whole bunch of metrics of stock abundance or fishing pressure. They just report the total income and jobs. But I would say that in general, all of the American focus has been on rebuilding stocks, not on production of food, jobs, etc. So how has the U.S. actually done? This is just total U.S. seafood landings, and you see during that period when we really built up fishing pressure, seafood landings went up considerably and have been stable to a little bit declining. Okay? So are we achieving? Well, if the goal is to rebuild fish stocks, yes, no question about it. If the goal is to provide food jobs and to support communities, there's any evidence that the rebuilding has led to the benefits we anticipated. Because we have to remember that rebuilding isn't our objective. Our objective is to achieve benefits for the nation. So I'll give a couple examples. So this is probably one of the big success stories at Sea Scallops, where this is total biomass, and starting again 1996. It's familiar. I mean, it's an important number. Scallops, and not too long after, about 4 or 5 years after, we saw a major increase in catch. This is it's been discovered. You know, it is a very rich town now. Scallop crewmen are making $100,000 a year. The boat owners have bought all the old houses that were built by whaling captains, and they all live on top of the hills. Well, a couple of those are. Some of the scallop fishermen are in jail, but one that comes to mind. But you know, a really great success. Gulf. Little spelling issue there. Red snapper. This is the spawning stock biomass. A really big rebuild in Gulf red snapper, and we've started to see an increase in catch. Anyone who's familiar with politics of the Gulf, I assume most of you are, realize there's still some significant issues in the Gulf, but in fact that rebuild is actually causing some of the major problems. But let's look at some other American fisheries. This is the one I know sort of best. This is the West Coast fish fishery. Environmental groups were calling this a collapsing ecosystem. Stocks were never overfished. And we've seen major increase in abundance, and we've seen nothing but continued decline in catch. The fishing industry is just a shadow of its former self. In fact, let me just go back to, let's go back to this graph and look at the U.S. West Coast. Right here. So, starting in '96, 6 or 7 rockfish species were declared overfished. Quotas were reduced dramatically. Stock has rebuilt. I mean, you know, it's almost 50% on average, 50% greater than the level that would produce maximum sustainable yield. There's the catch. Catch has continued to decline. So, why is it declining? Oh, that's in New England. Oh, I'm sorry. Well, that's a good point. Let's go back. Okay. West Coast. Why is it down? Why is it down? Your abundance is going up. Okay. There's two. First, the most interesting thing is that the TACs have gone up. TACs have gone up pretty well in proportion to the abundance, but the catch has not gone up. And there's 2 reasons, and we're actively trying to understand the relative importance. The first is that we have very strong choke species constraints. So it's a system where every boat has a quota on every major species, and we have, under the interpretation of the Magnuson-Stevens, we have very strict rebuilding requirements, And so the quota on several species dropped to almost nothing. So some boats for yellow eye rockfish have a quota of 4 pounds. Okay? What this means is that if they catch one fish, they have to stop fishing for the year. One fish. So, and the result is that people, they live in this, what Carl Walters calls the foraging arena, is a climate of fear. But they're not worried about predators. Look, if we're screwed. And so what they're very where they go and what they fish. They also have 100% observer coverage, so we know what they catch. And there's choke species are a big deal. In comparison, in the Gulf of Alaska, where no stocks have been listed as overfished and therefore requiring dramatic rebuilding requirements, the catch to TAC ratio has not declined. Another reason here, and the one I'm aware of until the last year, is that when we went into rebuilding, and so almost all the quotas for rockfish dropped dramatically, but also a number of the flatfish, markets disappeared. That the fishery could no longer supply many traditional markets, and those markets were taken over by Pangasius and tilapia from Southeast Asia. And I'll come back to this a little bit later. So what that means is that in our desire to be more sustainable and environmentally friendly, we have instead transported the environmental costs to Southeast Asia and to the aquaculture industries there. So let's go to the next slide. So New England groundfish is the same story. That the abundance has increased, and for many of the species like haddock and redfish, increased dramatically, but the catches have not increased for a lot of the same reasons. And again, there I think the catch to TAC ratio may be 40%. Now, yeah, I guess given the time, I've got time to go into this. In the late 1990s, the National Academy of Sciences was commissioned to the National Research Council to do a review of groundfish stock assessments. And I was part of, I think, Terry Quinn, I think, chaired that panel, and I was part of it. And we went to New Bedford, which was a shocking experience. Not New Bedford, went to Gloucester. A shocking experience for me, because all of my experience with fisheries, industry, government, science relationships had been on the West Coast. And to step into Gloucester, Massachusetts was just amazing experience. And we ended up writing a report that said, look, your stocks are overfished. You've got to take the short-term pain for the long-term gain. All right? I mean, and we lied. I mean, we didn't know it, but we were wrong, because they paid the long-term pain and they've seen no gain. In fact, I sort of figured this out after a couple years, and I published one of my least cited papers in National Fisherman. And the title of it was Why Fishermen Oppose Rebuilding Plans. And I basically pointed out that fishermen were very skeptical of rebuilding plans for a number of reasons. One is they don't trust the science, and that's particularly true in New England, but it's also true in the West Coast. And in fact, we've had, I think it's 4 species that were listed as overfished, went into dramatic rebuilding plans, and recent assessments suggest they were never overfished. Okay? The science at the time was wrong, and because we have this dramatic draconian reductions in catch if you get listed as overfished, they said, well, by the way, we're seeing all that, plenty of those fish. And I mean, I've heard it, if you hear it Steve has heard it in New England more than once, and most of the time the science is right, but it certainly has been wrong in New England more than once. So they don't trust the science, but even more important, that I said in my article, and has really proved to be true, is they didn't trust our promise that if the stocks rebuild, they could have more catch. And that certainly in the mixed stock fisheries of the United States has been the case, that you can rebuild those all you want, and the problem is the more science you do, the worse it's going to get, because we only assess in the West Coast 30 species. Well, there's 100 species, and I guarantee you that some of them are going to be overfished at every point in time. In fact, Jim Thorson, who was a student in our department and now works for the Northwest Fisheries Science Center, did a paper where he estimated that if you're fishing at the rate that would produce maximum sustained yield, a very significant portion of the time, 10 or 15% of the time, you will be overfished by the US definition, okay? Which means you have to go into rebuilding plan. And if you've got 100 species that are being assessed, then you're going to have 10 species overfished at any point in time, even if they're managed to maximum sustainable yield, okay? So the more we know about these fisheries and the more we apply our current strategy, the less we're going to be able to fish, because you're going to have species X, Y, or Z constraining the system. Okay, let me talk a little bit about status of fish stocks. So this is a plot that is very common. Oh, I've got a pointer for this stuff. Very used these days, where you put on the x-axis, sometimes called a Covey plot, the stock size, on the y-axis the fishing pressure, and then in the Covey plot you scale these relative to an MSY objective. And so in the US we say anything that's typically less than half, this is the MSY point, this dividers. So anything that's less than half of the biomass that would produce maximum sustained yield is called overfished. Anything that is above the level that would produce maximum sustained yield is called overfishing. Okay, so this is the worst, overfished and overfishing. Down here, stock should be recovering. This is an area that we would generally call fully exploited. That's not an official US term, but a lot of us have used a lot. And then out here is what you might call underexploited. So now let's just do a mental experiment. Let's assume that our objective is to maximize the sustainable yield from a fish stock, from any fish stock. Well, where would we be? Well, this is our target, right in this point here, okay? But if you've done archery or target practice with a rifle, you would expect to be half the time above your target, half the time below it. Half the time above the target, half the time below it. So essentially the way we've implemented our law and saying you cannot go above here guarantees we will not maximize the yield of our fish, because you can't go up here without being penalized in a whole bunch of ways. So if we look at, now this is data from all of the stocks. Oh, this is just US stocks, isn't it? Yeah, just US stocks, where we were in the last year that we had data. So in the size of the circle is the potential yield from the fish stock. And so that is probably Alaska pollock, given its size and where it is. And so the point here is that, that we've got most of our stocks down in this region. We've got some here that are where fishing pressure is now low, but the stocks are still below the MSY target, and we've got a few residual stocks hanging out up here. Okay? So, and then this X is the median value for across them. So on average, we're fishing our stocks at a little bit more than half of the fishing rate that would produce maximum sustainable yield, and our abundance of fish is about 1.5 times that would produce sustainable yield on average. So we're clearly doing a pretty good job of maintaining our fish stocks, but we're giving some okay, let me try this one. Okay, this is this is just fresh off the press, and I see there's at least one problem in this, but I can ignore that at the moment. This is what I call the Goldilocks plot, okay? The way that NOAA and FAO and almost the entire community report the status of stocks is how many are overfished, right? I mean, everybody, so in the US, we have a definition. Overfished is, again, it differs a little from council to council, but typically 50%, half of the level that produce maximum sustainable yield. FAO uses 80%. So there's a couple problems with that. The first is, well, what threshold do you use? Do you use the US 0.5? Do you use FAO 0.8? Some people in Europe want to use 1. That is, any stock that is below BMSY is overfished. And conceptually, that's true. It's at an abundance lower than produce maximum sustainable yield. But you've got a problem. What do you use as the threshold? Is there's a lot of difference between being just below the threshold and being way down. Let me just go back. Actually, I show that on, let's go back here. There's a big difference between a stock being right here and a stock being down here, right? And so you'd really like a metric that reflects how far below your MSY target you are. So in the Goldilocks plot, what I do is I say, if we continued fishing at the current fishing pressure, what would our long-term yield be? Okay, and how much is that relative to what you would get if you could manage it perfectly and produce maximum sustainable yield? And that's what's in green. Okay, what's in green is how much of the bar is the potential yield, and that one problem is these are off by a factor of 10. That is not 80 million metric tons, it's 8 million metric tons. And so you see that European non-Mediterranean, so that's European Atlantic, have a sustainable yield of 1 million tons, and they're achieving most of it at their current fishing pressure. But if a stock is not, you may be losing potential yield because you're fishing too hard, or you may be losing potential yield because you're fishing too little. Goldilocks analogy, it's too hot, or it's too cold, or it's just right. And what's in green is what you're achieving because you're just right. You're across stocks. So this is, for each stock, you say, what's its current fishing pressure? If we were to fish at that fishing pressure forever, how much yield would we get? How does that compare with what we would get if we could put it right at sustainable yield? What you see in blue is how much more you could get by fishing some stocks harder. That is, they're fished less than would produce maximum sustainable yield. And what you have in red is how much you're losing by fishing too hard, by stocks that are fished greater than maximum sustainable yield. So if we go back to the US case, losing yield from all of these stocks because you're fishing too hard. You're losing yield from all of these stocks because you're fishing too little. So I'd say that this kind of a graph, if you want to say, well, okay, how are we doing in fisheries? They're doing pretty well here. They could potentially manage every stock separately, which they can't. They could increase a little bit and they could increase a very little bit by fishing less. But Rainer Froese has said 50% of European Atlantic stocks are overfished. Well, what's it costing the European producers and consumers of fish? It's costing them almost nothing. Okay, because most of those stocks that are overfished, by his definition, are not losing any significant yield by being fished the way they are. Now you see South America is losing, that's a place that there's a lot of loss. But in fact, across all these other regions, there's really very little yield being lost because we're fishing too hard. There is, depending upon the place, there's a fair amount of yield lost because we're fishing too little. And another error in here is big Alaskan stocks aren't actually in here for some reason. The current version of the database doesn't Alaska pollock and Alaska cod. So, So the big, and the reason I just generated this graph a few weeks ago in its current, because they said the reason they developed their three classification systems, underfished, fully exploited, and overfished, was to give countries guidance on whether there was potential for more yield. That would be the blue, okay? To highlight the countries where they've got problems with. I think the Goldilocks plot does that. Okay, now let me shift gears a little bit and talk about sustainability. So this is, many of you may recognize, this is from the Brundtland Report. This is the definition of sustainable development. A development meets the needs of the present generation without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. In a little bit more detail, so Bill Clark is a professor at the John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard. He is the sustainability science editor in Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. This is their definition. So I'm saying, well, how do I measure the sustainability of a fishery? Okay, and our approach is grounded in of sustainable development that focuses on the well-being of people over the long run. In particular, it argues that the development of a social environmental system is sustained over a period of time if over that period, appropriately inclusive measures of well-being do not decline. In other words, if we can define what well-being from managing a fishery is, we want to manage it in such a way that that doesn't decline over time. Very different from when we think about sustainability of marine systems, but not at all inconsistent. So this is a graph from IUCN, the 3 pillars of sustainable development, and there are 3 pillars. There is economic growth, there is social progress, and there is environmental protection. In order to keep generating benefits from fisheries, we have to protect the environment. But what Clark and most of the people in what I'd call the deep sustainability movement say is you measure your performance by these things. Can you have economic growth, or can you have social progress? So what do we want from fisheries? We want food, we want recreation, we want jobs, we want income. And it's the environment that produces those benefits, but it is not an end in itself. We don't measure the sustainability of a system by how many fish stocks we have or how big the fish are. We measure the sustainability, or we should be, by whether we're continuously able to produce those benefits. Now that's almost unknown in the marine fisheries community. So here's the principles for fisheries certification. Principle 1, the condition of the fish stocks. It examines if there's enough fish to ensure the fishery is sustainable. Okay. Number 2, the impact of the fishery on the marine environment. It examines the effect that fishing has on the marine environment. Does the speaker just go off? Still on? Okay. Including other non-target species, marine mammals, and seabirds. And I first encountered MSC criteria. I was what we call a second stage reviewer of, are we okay on the microphone back there? Okay, that sounds a little different. And if we get into the nuts and bolts of principle 2, it says the fishery shall not transform the structure and function of the ecosystem. Okay? I read that and I said, well, that's interesting. No form of agriculture meets that standard, right? I mean, almost. I mean, there's a few grazing systems, and there's a few forms, but 99% of what you would find in your Whole Foods store would not meet MSC Principle 2. And yet you go to the fish counter and they're telling you you shouldn't eat those things that don't have the MSC. It's very interesting. Monterey Bay Seafood Watch. That's sort of the other real common seafood certification or advice system in the US. There is nothing in there about social or economics. It's all, and there's also nothing about non-marine ecosystems. It's all about marine ecosystems. And for that, just if I can, a little bit of a rant. Whoops, wrong button. Let's go back. Notice yellowfin tuna is a best choice, and yellowfin tuna is a worst choice. Okay. So is this about the sustainability of yellowfin tuna? No, it's not about the sustainability of yellowfin tuna. It's Monterey Bay Aquarium staff choice of what they consider acceptable environmental impacts. And in this case, it's built around bycatch. So pole and line fishing, US troll and pole and line fishing have reasonably low bycatch, and various kinds of other fishing have higher bycatch. So, okay, well, that makes sense. Well, there's a problem. At least to me, there's a problem. Fishing has 4 times the carbon footprint. So I personally consider carbon footprint a more serious concern than bycatch of other species that are not threatened with extinction. They're, you know, you're catching them, you don't want to catch them. So it all depends, and effectively all classification systems are not about the sustainability of the resource. They're almost all built around issues of other environmental impacts. So I probably got ahead of my slides. So seafood certification ignores social impacts of fishing, although they are all scrambling to build in something about slavery, and that they ignore anything about the economics of fishing. They ignore comparison of the environmental impacts of alternate forms of food production. So, you know, that they don't say, well, how does this compare to beef, chicken, or pork? And if I have time, I will talk about those things a little bit. And they also lull the public into thinking they're being good for the global environment by eating only the most sustainable fish. So I mentioned this to the students I met with this morning, but I mean, this is a rich man's game, right? And it's a way for you to feel good while we essentially export all the environmental problems somewhere else. So US, we import 80% of our fish. A lot of that, particularly the aquaculture, from parts of the world that don't have very high environmental standards. So we are basically saying, oh, we're going to have a very sustainable fisheries management system, but our fish consumption isn't very sustainable by those same metrics because it's mostly coming from somewhere else. And I've been very critical of these large ocean MPAs that the Sylvia Earles of the world say are so wonderful, because all we're doing, okay, we're not swordfish in US waters, and we're going to import this by US fishermen who are heavily regulated. We're going to get our swordfish by importing them from Taiwanese swordfish fishermen who are not very well regulated. And actually the US, I'm on the SSC of the Western Pacific Council, and one of the few big fisheries we deal with is the US-based tuna and swordfish longline fleet. And it's had a long history of struggling with bycatch of a whole bunch of things, sea turtles, interactions with various various marine mammals. And then last year there was an Associated Press article on sort of slavery or what really amounted to pretty terrible working conditions on the boats. But I was sitting there at Pier 38, or 78, well anyway, the pier boats come in with Jack Kittinger, who's the Conservation International manager of CI's efforts in the Western Pacific, and he said, you know, almost all of my colleagues in the NGO community would like to see this fishery gone. There's about 100, 150 boats based in Honolulu. He said, but this is the best longline fishery in the world. And he says, I like to see it because their could be done with observer coverage, with bycatch mitigation. But, it's a somewhat related aside. Okay, so now comes the quiz. So I would like you each a bunch of choices of things you could have for dinner, okay? And thinking across a range of environmental impacts. So impacts on biodiversity, impacts on carbon footprint, on nutrient release, acidification. What would be your ranking of these things? And this, I'm going to give you where I think they would be, and I've done some. Yes. While you're thinking, I'll just do another side story. That in 2010, I have my little finger still dipped in the wildlife world, and I was working in Serengeti National Park with the Frankfurt Zoo, who was a big NGO in the region, and the manager of the Frankfurt Zoo's programs in Africa, named Marcus Borner, who just won the Blue Planet Award last year. I'm not quite sure why he got the Blue Planet Award, because he works on land, but anyway, Marcus showed that Time magazine cover, and he said, look, I'm an environmentalist, should I stop eating sushi? And I took the question serious. I said, well, Marcus, if you don't eat sushi, what are you going to eat? And he said, chicken or pork. And this led me down, actually, it's really a career changer for me. I ended up doing a bunch of research on the relative environmental impacts of these things, and have a paper that's in press on that. And then I started 2 years later teaching a course on sustainability that's a freshman course, and it's proved very interesting. Anyway, so let's see, anyone want to put forward number who wasn't there this morning? Okay. What do you think the lowest, and I think that there is no question this answer is true. So what are we going to, number one, yes? Oh, you are so wrong. No. No. The best. Oh, okay, yeah, grass-fed beef is, okay, no. All right, no, I want the best. The best. Question. Farm mussels have a very low carbon footprint. The production per unit area is enormous. They soak up nutrients instead of releasing nutrients. They don't use any antibiotics. They use almost no fresh water. Real plus. Okay. So worst. It turns out that the worst is going to be is any form of ruminant. That ruminants just have a terrible. They use a staggering amount of water. Now, told just before we started that you've got 1 million cattle in Florida that basically graze on a natural habitat and don't have much impact there. That's they might actually bump up a little bit, but most cattle, chicken, or don't have a pork on here, do I? Cattle, chicken are fed crops, and how do you produce crops? You destroy a natural ecosystem. You pour in pesticides, fertilizer, usually irrigation. You lose all the biodiversity that would be in that place. So
it's grass-fed. You have grass-fed and free range.
Free range. Okay. Free range chicken are still fed.
Not necessarily.
Oh. I mean, that free range chicken, if you go to the grocery store, that simply means they're cage free, right?
I go to the farm around the corner.
Yeah, well, I don't know. I mean, I call my chickens free range, but they're still fed. I mean, there's almost no eggs on the chicken on the market that is not fed. Grass-fed beef has actually, turns out, a worse carbon footprint than regular beef. I'm not quite sure why that is, but it's certainly the case for the studies that have been done. But the reason beef does so badly is it's just got a terrible carbon footprint. But as I say, it depends a lot on how you weigh these things. So this would be my ranking: mussels, pollock from Alaska, then organic vegetables. What's the big difference here is organic vegetables, like any form of farming, require the loss of a natural ecosystem. Farm salmon are surprisingly good. They have a pretty low carbon footprint, and it's because two reasons. They're fed a lot of small pelagic, themselves have a low footprint, and they're also more efficient than, say, chickens or pork at converting feed to meat because they don't have to stand up and stuff. Shrimp from the Gulf of Mexico and all shrimp fisheries have terrible carbon footprints. Actually, the worst footprint of any fishery I know, it's even worse than beef, is lobster. And Peter Tidemeers, who some of you may know of at Dalhousie University, is really the guru on carbon footprint. And he was asked in an interview about, well, do you ever eat lobster? And he said, yes, but I feel guilty. Okay, let's continue on. Okay, I want to, this is an old expression that I can't actually, never figured out who really first said it, but what gets measured gets managed. And if we go back to how NOAA has been reporting fisheries performance, it has been reporting on the status of fish stocks. Now notice this, provides fisheries managers with an account of how well current fisheries management measures are working. So it's really saying that if you want to understand how well our fisheries management measures are working, look at the status of fish stocks. Well, if you wanted to maximize that, what would you do? You would stop fishing. Oh, got ahead of myself again. This, the sustainability measure that NOAA uses. Overfishing status is known, overfish status is known, overfishing is not occurring, stock biomass is above the level, okay, again, the entire measure of fisheries performance is stock abundance and stock fishing pressure based, no consideration of whether we're generating human benefits. Yeah, the fishery sustainability measure has been rising and rising and rising, but we're not looking at how well the fisheries are performing with respect to what we want to do, which is produce benefits to society. So my somewhat radical assessment is that U.S. fisheries policy has mistakenly assumed that stopping overfishing was a necessary step to maximizing benefits from our fisheries. And I would contend that the precautionary management, including everything from the 10-year rebuilding requirement to that no stock should be subject to overfishing, is actually keeping us from realizing the potential benefits from our fisheries. Not a popular message, I have to say. So I want to talk about a thing called goal displacement. And I think it's now reasonably widely accepted in the business world and business and government and the political science world, is a major problem in assessing bureaucratic performance is the difficulty in judging final social outcomes from the work of public agencies. As a result, public agencies are frequently evaluated based on the outputs they produce. Okay? So I'll just give you some examples. I first ran into this working with my sometimes collaborator Mark Mangle. And actually, I may tell that story since I still have some time, but he was working on, he was at Davis at the time and was working with one of his colleagues on control of the Mediterranean fruit fly, and which is an occasionally gets imported to the States in fruit shipped in, escapes, then they go out and they spray the shit out of California, and the State Department of Agriculture was reporting its performance as how many acres they sprayed. Okay? They weren't reporting their performance on whether they're controlling medfly. It was the more they sprayed, the better. Okay? Okay, as Steve mentioned, I really started my fisheries work looking at salmon hatcheries. In many hatcheries, the performance measure was juvenile fish release. And in fact, hatchery managers had an incentive-based salary bonuses based on how many pounds of baby fish they released, with no measure of whether they ever survived and came back. Okay? So now let's get to even more fun. Marine protected areas. That the enormous advocacy movement for marine protected areas has now decided and in effect said our measure of success is how many acres of the ocean are put in no-take areas. So what are we seeing? We're seeing vast portions of the ocean where there's almost no fishing going on being declared marine protected areas and being considered a great success. And the whole MPA movement has totally lost sight of what are we trying to do. We're trying to improve the performance of fish stocks and preserve biodiversity. And they've completely lost sight of that and say, okay, we just need to put more and more acreage into protected areas. And I would argue that fish stock rebuilding is the same thing. We decided that our measure, as I showed you on the NOAA website, we're measuring performance by whether we're rebuilding fish stocks, not by whether we're producing benefits to society. So, as an example, I was in D.C. in October with two colleagues from our NC SNAP group with the purpose to do a briefing for people in government, primarily Senate and House aides. And my two colleagues with me were, you know, I mean, I was more skeptical that all this stock rebuilding that is so good, that is so evident, that I was pointing out the issues, and they said, well, yeah, but what would have happened if we hadn't gone into it? Okay, so what would have happened if we'd continued fishing like we did in 1996? Okay, and so after I got back from DC, I did that for the west coast of California, the groundfish fishery. So what you see here is what happened in the catch. So back in the 50s, about 20,000 tons, went up to 100,000 tons, and then has declined down to about 10,000 tons. Okay? So I then just reran all of our assessments in a very quick and dirty way. I've got a student just starting in a few months who will do this properly. But this is my projection of what would have happened if we continued with the exploitation rates we had in 1996. We would actually be catching 3 times more fish. Okay. We would have had more jobs, more food, and more profit, but some stocks would have been continued to be overfished. So is that a problem? Now, it's certainly not a problem in the sense that we would have had more stocks. We would have still been producing more fish, more jobs, and more profit. But because we've come to equate being overfished as somehow reducing these things, we'd say that's terrible. I mean, does anyone really care whether we're at 0.5 or 0.7 BMSY from any other perspective than the production of yield? Because remember, those reference points are yield-based reference points. And I find it amazing that people seem more worried about whether there's 20,000 tons of a fish in the ocean or 40,000 tons than they are about the cattle feedlot that's down the street. Places they will never go, they will never see, and yet somehow that's become more important than the environmental costs of land-based agriculture. So what I would say is let's get back to the basics. Let's decide what's important, identify the objectives of the fishery. And obviously much more complicated. It's not only yield and jobs. We've got the Endangered Species Act, we've got the Marine Mammal Protection Act. We've got very complex objectives. But we should sit down and rethink our fisheries management plans, not on whether they meet the legal framework of the Magnuson-Stevens Act, but what it would take to actually produce the objectives we're interested in. I know this is ridiculous because we're totally constrained by the lawyers, but that's what we should be doing. Let me just close with another problem. It's a problem that I increasingly see is there is now a giant vested interest in what I would call marine conservation. So Pew Foundation has, I suspect, 1,000 employees around the world lobbying for marine protected areas. NGOs, WWF, Oceana have large, substantial staffs associated with their marine conservation efforts. These people all need to be paid. They're, as in any organization, their fundamental objective is to stay in business and keep their people employed. And so what you see is even when most sustainability problems are solved, they've got to keep finding another problem. And what you will see is that if you sort of follow the bigger NGO picture is that overfishing in a lot of places is not a serious problem, and so the latest thing is traceability. Well, they've got staff all over the world working on how you can make sure that this fish that ended up in your in your store exactly where it came from. And I'll close it with one last anecdote because I've worked in New Zealand a long time, and a guy from WWF US asked me to work with the New Zealand fishing industry to see about getting orange roughy, which has been icons of failed fishing, into a fisheries improvement plan with the ultimate goal of being MSC certified. And so I met with some of the people in the fishing industry, and he wanted the fishing improvement plan to be partnered with WWF New Zealand and the New Zealand fishing industry. And I met with them, and the New Zealand fishing industry said, "That's ridiculous. Why would we ever work with WWF New Zealand on an MSC certification?" Because the biggest fishery in New Zealand, hoki, had been certified for 10 years at that time by MSC, and it was still on WWF New Zealand's red list. They said, "Don't buy." So he said, they're never going to take, they're never going to take orange roughy off their red list. And so I went back to the guy I know in WWF, and I said, "Why are they so strange?" I said, "Bill, why are they so strange?" And he said, "Oh, it's all because of the Rainbow Warrior." Okay, and I said, "Explain to me a little bit more." He says, "Well, 1986, the Rainbow Warrior was blown up by French agents in Auckland Harbor. And ever since then, this was Greenpeace has been the favorite NGO in New Zealand. I mean, when the new Rainbow Warrior comes into town, you'll see lineups a mile long of people to go worship and he said, WWF New Zealand simply could not raise money if their position was different than Greenpeace. Okay? So it's all about the money. They need to raise money to stay in business, and it's not about the actual environmental policy. So anyway, I will stop there. Thank you very much.
Maybe have some time for questions for Ray. I'm sure there are at least a few on. I have a few. I was interested in when you did your best to worst list. If we made a
I can tell you, I've got this paper that's in press. We've done that comparison for energy use, carbon footprint, nutrient released, and acidifying compounds released. I mean, obviously, anything that is wild capture wins on fresh water use. That almost, fisheries use very little fresh water, antibiotics, and fertilizer. I think for shrimp, I think there's a lot of overlap. Shrimp's got, I think, farm shrimp has almost as much variability. I mean, some farm shrimp production is very carbon intensive, farm shrimp. Some is much less. Farm salmon versus wild salmon's going to win because they're caught very efficiently. So, in fact, we're just doing collecting more data on that to update some of the global databases. I mean, again, you have, it all depends on how much you weigh different things. Another one, I mean, when I teach my undergraduate course and I say, what's the biggest long-term threat to global food security? Well, let's say to the global ability to produce food, okay? Anyone want to, I mean, I think it's just dead obvious, but. Not fertilizer, not water, no. 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 I mean, beef's got a lot of costs, but no, there's something much, I mean, you can make it, one of my colleagues makes a good argument that in 200 years we'll only be able to produce a quarter of the amount of food we do now. No, that's interesting. Okay. Soil. There's a great quote, again, that no one knows quite where it came from. It says, essentially, human society, for all of its wonders, is dependent upon two things: 6 inches of topsoil and the fact that it rains. And so we have lost something like 30% of global topsoil since the arrival of the plow in the United States, and soil erosion rates, even organic, all soil erosion rates are almost all are 10 to 100 times faster than soil generation rates. So it's a serious concern. And again, you don't have that problem with capture fisheries. Other question? Mm-hmm?
So in your carbon footprint measurements for the cows, do you include methane output?
Yeah, oh yeah. So there's a process called life cycle assessment, or LCA, that works through all the inputs, all the outputs. And what I've done, really prompted by this conversation,